Hello everyone. Today we're going to compare form and genre for your coursework texts. Now, Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings have many similarities. Dragons, formidable female warriors, hardcore fan bases, to name just a few. Their similarities are in part due to their belonging to the fantasy genre. There are certain staples that we expect of both a fantasy film and a fantasy TV series, and Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings exploit these to maximum effect. However, they are different in that the first is a television series, obviously, while the second is a trilogy of films. Now, this might seem like an irrelevant distinction in some ways, until you begin to think about the implications of these different forms. Across 3 films, even if you do have some of them pushing about 4 hours, the Lord of the Rings trilogy really is only able to tell a single overarching narrative. For those of you who know it, that's obviously Frodo's quest to destroy the One Ring. By comparison, BingeWatch.com reckons that Game of Thrones' 60 episodes span 2 days, 22 hours and 14 minutes. The longer form of the television drama allows the creators to explore many more narrative threads in much more detail than Lord of the Rings was able to. As a consequence, the writers were able to give certain characters perhaps a greater level of psychological nuance than Peter Jackson was able to do in Lord of the Rings. One character alone, for example, is used as a vehicle for the creators to explore issues of outsider status, inherited privilege, Machiavellian self-interest. In the, by comparison, much shorter Lord of the Rings, the bad guy's just an evil, angry, fiery eyeball with very little backstory. Bit of a disclaimer here, I've not really watched Game of Thrones, but I do think, in spite of what I've just said, Lord of the Rings is an artistic masterpiece. Hopefully with the example I've just given, I've not just proved my nerd qualifications, but I've demonstrated how fruitful it can be to compare the forms of 2 texts. Because this is where you should begin when you compare the technical choices made by the writers of your 2 coursework texts. Compare form and genre. To illustrate how to do this with written texts as opposed to TV and film, let's look at texts from elsewhere in your A-level course. In Year 13, you'll study prose and you'll compare The Handmaid's Tale with Frankenstein. So let's take those as an example. Products of their respective time periods, the 2 novels are different genres. The Handmaid's Tale is a dystopia, inspired by social trends that Margaret Atwood observed in 1980s and 1970s America and Western Europe. Atwood imagined how biological science might be manipulated in a world where reactionary conservative forces fought back against the increase in women's liberties brought about by particular technologies such as the contraceptive pill. Atwood herself tells us that she actually rejects the idea of the science fiction genre label, even though many people have tried to pin that label on her novel. She prefers the term speculative fiction as more appropriate to her book, and she argues that it's because all of the atrocities that happen in this dystopian society of The Handmaid's Tale have already occurred at some point in human history and geographically in some place. She suggests these events could really happen in a way that isn't true of traditional science fiction, where you might have aliens or other kinds of monsters, perhaps. By contrast, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is not just traditional science fiction, but in fact regarded by lots of people as the first proper example in the genre. Shelley's use of the science fiction genre, as you know from having studied the first parts of it, allows her to criticise the experimental hubris of the Enlightenment period. Male, immoral experimentation leads to death and destruction wrought by a creature that is gothically imaginary, gothically fantastical, and so far as we know, could never have really physically existed in the 19th century of Shelley's writing. The hyperbole, therefore, of the creature's description adds a particular punch to the moral message that Shelley's pushing. Unlike Atwood's novel, The events of Frankenstein could not literally have happened. The genre liberates Shelley to create a modern allegory. Atwood, on the other hand, is invested in making the world of The Handmaid's Tale feel plausible at every step, like it could really happen. However, in spite of their differences, both novels in fact use the same form, the epistolary form. They're constructed in episodes. Letters from the Arctic Circle tell the story of Frankenstein, while tape recordings found and reassembled tell us the story in Atwood's tale. Both authors chose to use a form that would add suspense and suggest a degree of unreliable narrative in their novels. Both are clearly invested in forcing their reader to ask questions and to question what's real and maybe what's imagined in their fiction. The form allows both novelists to do that. So back to your coursework. Each of the writers of your coursework texts chose their form and genre for very specific reasons. We know that Angela Carter wrote short stories intended to draw out the latent content of traditional fairy tales. Quote from her, of course. They're dark, sexual, and abusive undertones. What genre did the writer of your second coursework text use? How did they use form to convey their message? And which aspects of those choices led to similarities with Carter's texts? Which differences?